Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. And on behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching this evening's program online. I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forum's lead sponsors, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, as well as the Mass Cultural Council and our media sponsor, the Boston Globe. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We're so delighted to have this opportunity to explore Mrs. Kennedy's early adulthood with our distinguished guests tonight. I'm now honored to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm pleased to extend a warm welcome to the library to Carl Sferrazza Anthony. He is the author of a dozen books about presidents' wives and families, including As We Remember Her, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, in the words of her family and friends, The Kennedy White House, Family Life and Pictures, 1961 to 1963, and the two-volume First Ladies, the saga of the president's wives and their power, 1789 to 1990. He has served as guest curator for presidential library exhibits, written for numerous national publications, and served as contributing editor to George Magazine. Camera Girl, The Coming of Age of Jackie Bouvier Kennedy is his latest book. And I'm so glad to welcome our moderator for this evening back to the library virtually. Eileen McNamara is Professor Emerita of the Practice of Journalism at Brandeis University and an award-winning former reporter and columnist for the Boston Globe, where she won an individual Pulitzer Prize for commentary and contributed to the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the clergy sex abuse scandal of the Archdiocese of Boston. She is also the author of Eunice, the Kennedy Who Changed the World. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm delighted to be able to be here, Ellen, to be able to put some questions after reading this remarkable book. I think, like a lot of you in the audience, I thought I knew everything there was to know about Jackie Kennedy Onassis. But it turns out I didn't, because the author who's with us tonight has focused on a really critical, foundational period of her life. Between the time that she was debutante of the year in 1947 and the time when she became Mrs. John F. Kennedy in 1953. These are the formative years of her life that we don't know so much about. And what emerges is a very different Jackie Bouvier than I had been exposed to in the past. What can I ask you, Carl, do you think are our biggest misconceptions about Jackie?
Well, I think I remember some person, I don't know if it was you, Saidi, somebody once referred to her as a pampered dilettante. Mm-hmm. And I really thought that is still sort of like people would acknowledge her intelligence, like that she had the ability to be clever in a moment or two, but they didn't really acknowledge her depth. And I had the great opportunity before she died I was writing my first book, and she cooperated and helped me write it, and couldn't help herself from editing a little bit. But she was a person of enormous substance, and you know, so many people try and compare her to her sister, to her mother, to her schoolmates, whoever. She was just from the get-go, she was an individualist with a capital I.
Well, you're right that she had often given her friends advice in college and high school that their goal in life should be to be distinctive.
Yes.
Be distinct so that you stand out. She was an indifferent student at Vassar and at George Washington University in the district. So where does the brilliance that you detect in her emerge first in her life? Where do you see it?
Imagination. It's her imagination. And it's her voracious reading. She was reading complex books and novels as when she was like under 10. She was reading Gone with the Wind. She was reading big books with mature themes. And I don't know this, but I can it's not hard to imagine when you look at what is on the record as evidence that the first 11 years of her life were very emotionally upsetting. There was a lot of trauma. The marriage of her parents was horrific, and even after the parents divorced, the bitter, acrimonious relationship between the ex-husband and ex-wife, her parents, it just continued. It just never stopped. And I think the only place she could go, there was a story about once where she just had gotten quiet at the table or something, and her mother demanded to know, what are you thinking about? So even like the freedom to just think on her own, her mother tried to control what she was thinking. So I think reading and escape into her imagination, that was the way she protected herself from some of the emotional trauma that she witnessed and was a victim of.
Well, she has this in common with Jack Kennedy in some ways, doesn't she? He, of course, was very ill as a child and spent a lot of time in bed recuperating from one ailment or another. And he turned to books,
Yes,
the source of comfort and education. So they do have that in common.
it's very interesting that there's a letter I quote in the book. I think it's I quote it from there. Now I can't remember, but it was to the famous, he's so famous, I can't remember his name. The famous American novelist, was it maybe John Steinbeck, who she at first approached about writing a biography of President Kennedy after his death. And she went on in great detail about how much he read and how she was just astounded by it. But she could almost be talking about herself, because I think that's the other thing that I hope I bring out in this book is, what was their commonality? It was intellect. It was reading. It was literature. It was historical figures. I mean, they were less likely to argue about the way a room's furniture was arranged than about whether Napoleon's strategy like they were so intellectual, the two of them, and their intellect was grounded in history, but it wasn't just sort of fact-based stuff. They both were fascinated by the sort of timeless story of human nature. So and you see this with Jackie too. She'll like compare people in her life to figures out of Greek mythology, or when she's driving through Ireland with her stepbrother, and they're coming across these peasant folks in Ireland on these small roads, she'll say that looks like such and such a character, from Ivanhoe, like so it was a real obscure kind of humor, but he was that way too. Yeah.
So it's as if you're saying that she lived in part in her imagination.
That's right.
And I want to quote you something from your book. that you wrote about her. You said it is difficult to distinguish the degree to which her stories, her embellishments of incidents that happened in her own life, for instance, were a matter of her real perception of herself as opposed to the image she wanted others to see.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that quote because it reminded me immediately of the famous Joseph P. Kennedy quote that he told all of his children. It doesn't matter who you are. It matters who people think you are.
Yeah. Which is today, we would say, the unhealthiest thing in the world.
But there is something to it, though, right? I mean, she was a person from a very young age who was aware of the image that she projected.
Yes.
You tell the story about her applying for this very coveted internship at Vogue magazine. And she actually wins this, in part by sort of embroidering stories about why she missed the deadline for submitting an essay. But tell us why she wouldn't have taken this incredible opportunity when she clearly, from your writing, wanted to be a writer, wanted to be a photographer, loved to illustrate, loved to paint. Here was an opening for a creative life. Why did she let that pass her by?
She really did want it. I mean, different reasons have been given by different people.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that seems the most believable is that her mother pressured her not to take that job. And that was because it would place her for 6 months in New York before going to Paris for 6 months. And that meant she would be living with her father.
Mm-hmm.
And her mother didn't want that. And so, and she was very bitter about this, and very angry about this.
Mm-hmm.
But she did kind of do as she was told, which is contrary to how she so much conducted the rest of her life, because she usually found a way to get what she wanted and do what she wanted.
Well, eventually, of course, she sort of did get, she didn't get that Vogue position, but she did wind up at the Washington Times Herald.
Yes.
With a writing job that comes to her not only because of her talent, but because of the connections that only a few years before had gotten Kathleen Kick Kennedy a job at the same newspaper.
Yeah.
So how did that come about?
Well, her stepfather, who's somebody who's been made sort of kind of almost been made fun of a lot in a lot of previous books. He's been sort of dismissed and diminished.
Hugh Auchincloss, you're talking about here.
Hugh, her stepfather, who she called Unc, like Uncle Hughie. She'd call him Unc, U-N-K. She would refer to him in writing. And he felt bad for her.
Mm-hmm.
And he rarely defied his wife's wishes, but he wanted to help her. And so he asked a friend of his, Arthur Kroc, who was the bureau chief of the New York Times in Washington. And Kroc, who was friends with Joseph Kennedy and also friends with Frank Waldrop, called Waldrop and said, I have another one of these bright little girls, kind of, you're like, she's a 21-year-old woman, but calling her a bright little, bright-eyed little girl kind of thing. He tried her out. But she was too ambitious too early. It's so funny. He starts her out at the reception desk, basically a gopher. Mm-hmm. And she's just really not good at it. She's not interested in it. She wants to write. She's there to write. And she, in that soft voice. And I, interviewed Frank Waldrop for As We Remember Her some years ago. And but he also did he's left many oral histories, and he did many interviews. And he had that kind of irascible voice, right out of the front page. You could see the cigar ashes, dropping on his knee. And he would say, Miss Bouvier, and he'd yell at her, and he would imitate her and say, yes, Mr. Waldrop, and so it was this sort of funny game between the two of them, where he was playing the editor and she was playing the young, innocent columnist. But she turned that column into something absolutely fascinating that eventually I found in old copies of the Washington Times-Herald. She was only there 2 or 3 months when they were advertising for potential subscribers, and they're saying, among the regular things you'll be getting is reading the inquiring photographer, as it was first called. Before they called it the inquiring camera girl for her. She
got a byline on that column.
She got a byline,
which no one had before.
No one had a byline, and no woman had the job, and no woman and no person, male or female, had gotten the byline. And then they just changed it to the inquiring camera girl. She made it so distinctly her own.
And she did that by an interesting combination of the kinds of questions that she would ask people. The job was basically man and woman in the street interviews. Yeah. She would go out with her big, huge camera and ask them a question, and all the responses would wind up in her column. Some of them were frivolous and silly. Some of them were pretty serious. Yeah. What do you make of this combination she had of frivolity and really public policy?
I think that's who she really was. That's the stuff that was on her mind. Mm-hmm. Sometimes she was a little lazy. I remember after the election of Eisenhower as president, when Republicans were coming into town, she asked the same question to 4 or 5 different people each day, right. But, how do you feel about the Republicans coming in? How do you feel about the Democrats leaving? So once in a while, she got a little, I won't say lazy, but unimaginative. Mm-hmm. Not every day was brilliant, but most days were pretty damn brilliant, and poignant. To me, some of the most haunting of the columns are very poignant questions. Do you think hope ever dies? What are you living for?
No.
So or she'd be kind of funny and say, what were you thinking of as I just came up to ask you what you're thinking of?
Right.
So
did you really believe that this was going to be a jumping off point for a deeper repertorial career?
Yes, because she was pushing already to make a name for herself at the paper. She always wanted to be a feature writer, a magazine writer. I didn't find any real evidence that she was necessarily inclined to write a book. Mm-hmm. But I think she loved magazine length articles. And so and she really loved the turn of phrase. She loved the nuance of words. She loved sort of the sound of a sentence. And so she was a very careful writer. She was artful, but she pushed and pushed and pushed at the paper. And she got, I think, a total of, I found 6 feature articles that she got into the paper because she pushed. One of them landed her on the front page of the paper and also almost got her fired. Mm-hmm.
Is that the confrontation with the Eisenhower girls?
Yes. Yeah. This is the incoming First Lady, Mamie Eisenhower's younger sister, had 2 younger daughters. And Jackie Bouvier, intrepid, girl photographer, camera girl, she stalked them. She went and found out what school they went to. And she waited outside of school, and I interviewed Mamie Moore, who was so nice to me. And she remembered that Jackie was wearing a hot pink high heel shoes, a skirt and everything, and how she just came at them and just started following them and asking them questions about what it was like now that their uncle had been elected president. And even though she had her camera, she didn't take their photographs, but she drew. It was the first time her illustrations also appeared in the paper. And so it made the front page. It was a great human interest story, but Mamie's sister was mad as hell. And she had some mutual friends of Frank Waldrop, and she got on the phone and basically said, I want you to fire that brash young camera girl.
Well, if any of my former students are listening from my ethics class, that's a no. You do not approach children on the street without clearing it with their parents.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the illustrations are a fascinating part of her creative life too. She did a wonderful illustration of herself with a camera that accompanied the column for a while.
Yeah. And she also the summer after she was accepted to Vogue and still thought that maybe she was going to pull a fast one on her mother, and she went to the Vogue offices for a week. She went with her sister to Europe, and that's when the famous book One Special Summer was written. Now, without being in any way disrespectful to her sister, who later claimed to co-write the book, out of I don't know how many pages, I only found 2 pages that her sister wrote, and all the drawings were done by Jackie. So Jackie basically wrote the book. But I think she drew on the stories of her sister, and those are hysterical illustrations too.
Right.
And that was the summer she really became obsessed. Her interest in photography started right before she left she had always been interested. She had a little Brownie camera, and she had photo albums that she put together when she was very young. But then getting ready to go spend a year in Europe, she finagled her mother and father. Boy, did she work them both over. And
some might say she manipulated both of them to get that camera.
Well, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The two of them were master manipulators. The father was a charmer. The mother was, I don't want to say battle axe, but I don't know. That's not a nice word, but the mother was formidable. So she had to like look out for herself with the two of them. She'd be eaten alive by the two of them. And
she managed to get money from both of them to buy the camera.
To get the camera, she got more money than the camera cost, and she pocketed the cash, the extra cash. And she sort of said, well, Mommy didn't ask me about it, so I didn't tell her about it, But she brings the camera to Europe, and she's in Paris, based in Paris, but then she's also, in London, Ireland, Spain, Italy, and then next year, she doesn't take the Vogue job. She starts at the I should say she graduates, and then they go to Europe with her sister. So she comes back to do her senior year at George Washington University, and then goes to Europe with her sister. And that's the summer she met Fellini, and through their mutual friend Benno Graziani, the photographer for Paris Match magazine. They're all, of course, young people at the time. So they had a lot. It seems like Italy was that trip was mostly about her exploring Italy with her sister. That was the summer of 51.
Mm-hmm. And she comes back to the United States, and she's in that job as the inquiring photographer for what, a year and a half, maybe. And she's introduced to Jack Kennedy at Charlie Bartlett's house.
Yeah, their
who was
first
a newspaper writer himself.
Yes, and by the way, right now in the hardback copy of Camera Girl, this story is in the footnotes. But the other day, I was asked by my editor if there were any changes I wanted to make in the paperback, and I took out what was from the footnote and put it into the main text, because Charlie Bartlett, in the summer of 1947, Jackie writes, all of June, it's all about going to one wedding after the other. And I'm sorry, summer 49. And she's just constantly going to weddings. And one of them is her friend, Charlie Bartlett, who lives in Washington. And Charlie's brother is getting married to one of the Pulitzer family, a member of the Pulitzer family. And he's friends from Palm Beach with Jack Kennedy, who's a congressman. And he's like, I got a girl I want you to meet. And she tells Jackie, there's this guy I really want to introduce you to. And he's taking her across the crowded dance floor when they come across a friend of his father's, the famous prize fighter, Gene Tunney,
Mm-hmm.
or Jack Tunney. Now I can't remember if it's Gene or Jack, but she gets delayed. By the time Charlie gets her over to where Jack Kennedy is, he's left. So
a near miss.
A near miss. The intention was there. And then they are introduced when she's at George, when she's about to graduate. It's like all this 1 month period where she gets her dad out of rehab, she graduates from George Washington, she wins the Vogue contest, she meets Jack Kennedy, and she goes to Europe. 5 big turning points all in 1 month, May 1951. So that's when she and Jack Kennedy first sit down together and get to know each other a little bit. And then 6 months later, she's visiting Charlie Bartlett and his family in Florida. And they are going, she's staying with her stepfather and his family. And Charlie takes them over to the Kennedy house. And Jack Kennedy has just come back from his multi-nation tour of Middle Eastern and Asian countries. He went to Vietnam. And Jackie's familiar with Vietnam because of her year in Paris.
Because she studied at the Sorbonne. And among the other things that she studied there were politics. And she was following the French intervention in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And was fascinated by
really
that.
Claude Durenti, who was her host in Paris, it was her Claude's mother, Madame Durenti, Giseline Durenti, and her daughters, Claude is still alive now, 90, could be, I think, 94. It just turned 94 this month. She remembered a dinner that Jackie went to with her and a friend of hers who was a soldier who had just come back from Vietnam, and how he was talking about what was then called the French-Vietnamese War, because France was trying to retake Vietnam as its colony, and Ho Chi Minh was less a communist and more just a nationalist. He wanted Vietnamese independence.
Right.
And so, Jackie, it's not hard to see why young Jackie Bouvier sympathized with the Vietnamese wanting their autonomy. Right. I mean, it's not a stretch to see, having these parents that she did, that she would want autonomy as opposed to paternalism. So she seemed to have a natural inclination. As much as she loved France, she also saw France as a bit of, a bit overbearing. Mm-hmm. And yes, she loved the French culture and everything, but there are little comments that come up now and then where she was not 100%, wild in favor of the French. So anyway,
her studies about French imperialism when she was there at the Sorbonne, that comes into play as she gets to know Jack Kennedy, doesn't it? I mean,
it really does.
He's just come back from this trip abroad, which his father was famous for sending all of the Kennedy children abroad so that they would have a deep understanding of the world. But he's not bilingual, as she is. She's fluent in French. So when it comes time for him to talk about what he saw and what he thinks about what's happening in French Indochina, he relies on her, doesn't he?
Yes, but I will say this, though, about him. This is important, and it's very important. And, a lot of baloney is out there in the popular ideas of, oh, he was a good-looking guy, and he was from a wealthy family and all this stuff. No, this guy was wicked intelligent. He studied, he read, he studied, he read, he studied, he read. He was so intelligent. He understood.
Just for the record, he was a really good-looking guy who came from a wealthy family.
Yes, of course. But there's a lot of good-looking guys from wealthy families who don't end up having a life-threatening illness and risking that to take a tour of Japan and Pakistan and Iran and Vietnam so he could see what the real situation is himself. And he did that as a congressman. And when he comes back and he starts traveling through Massachusetts on what is the beginning of his Senate campaign, he has a big world map, and he pulls the world map down and he talks about Vietnam. He's, talking to these, housewives from, Braintree about, Ho Chi Minh, but he's doing it in such a storytelling way that he never talks down to his audience. He lifts them up. He elevates. He never presumes anybody to be ignorant. This is really a factor, the way he interacts with crowds. It's a factor in his success. But so I just take that diversion because I don't want to take credit away from him. They have a mutual interest in Vietnam and a mutual knowledge. And I would say he has more knowledge, obviously, having been there, then getting elected to the Senate. But he wants to oppose the U.S. continuing to financially support France in its war against Vietnam, in its war to retake Vietnam. And so he's preparing to challenge on a budget amendment in the Senate a foreign aid package to France. And it's all about Vietnam. And to prepare for that speech, he really wants to go deep. And that's where I think, for me as the author of this book, I don't think most people feel this way, but I felt this way. You really see the depth of Jackie Bouvier's mind, the way she is able to synthesize so many moving parts. First of all, translating from French, and then like reading through very dry military documents and treaties and translating it all in English so it will help him better comprehend the situation, the history of Vietnam and France as he makes his speech. So
she writes the 86-page report on which he bases two speeches that he gives on this topic in the United States Senate.
Yeah, that one in June of 53, and then a big one in April of 54.
Right.
Yeah.
So her interests and his interests collide in lots of ways. There's these political issues that they share a concern about. But there's also their biographies overlap in so many ways. I mean, you've talked a little bit about the dysfunction in the Bouvier family and the ugly divorce that really shaped a lot of her childhood. She had a mother who was very stern and very cold, and she had a father who was a philanderer. That sounds a little bit like the Kennedy family to me.
Yeah, it does. It's so interesting how this is something I didn't think of until after I finished the book. So This is not in the book, but this is just an observation. I think she really understood him. Maybe more than he understood her. I think she understood him because he opened up to her. Later in life, she discloses, I believe it is to her son. It was a relative, and now I can't remember, but that basically Jackie did not blame Rose Kennedy, but she reported that Jack felt his mother had been not demonstrative of love to him.
She wasn't. She wasn't to any of her children.
Yeah.
And Jack says that. My mother never said she loved me in my life.
Yeah, and that really haunted Jackie. I mean, one could start, getting into all kinds of semantics on this, but I think for both of them, reading is the escape from both of their emotional pain and sometimes feeling isolated, escaping into their imagination. I mean, I will also say this: Jackie was prone to depression. She had a lot of depression, and of course that is all about the way people think. And so she was a little bit of a perfectionist, and I think when things fell a little bit short, she wasn't always that way. Sometimes she was able to laugh. You see in all the letters that she wrote to her stepbrother Yusha, she's always making fun of herself. She's always able to laugh at herself.
When she becomes engaged to Jack, though, if you're describing somebody who's coming out of a family where affection was not forthcoming for her, her father was a gambler and lost money in the stock market, so her financial situation is pretty precarious. Her mother is after her to make a good match, which for Janet meant money. So she meets Jack Kennedy, and I read your book and I come away with the impression I've had in reading many stories about their engagement, that it was transactional, that for Jackie, this was money, security, and a place on the world stage. If she wasn't going to have her own career, she had ambition that she would transfer to Jack. And for Jack, who was himself quite the womanizer, that he would never have made it to the White House without a respectable partner at his side. His father made clear to him that he had to marry. Jackie was beautiful, intelligent, Catholic. She filled the bill. Where does depression come into this picture? Because there's something missing in the middle of this, which is romance of any kind.
I think there is romance. I think she was very much in love with him, and in love with his mind, and in love with his intelligence. There is
But she was not unaware of what he did with his body when he wasn't with her.
right, but I think she operated on a little bit of a higher, if I can say that. I don't know if I'm being politically incorrect or politically correct by saying that, monogamy was not necessarily. I think she was more concerned with emotional monogamy. Let's put it that way. And I think that was important to her. Emotional monogamy. And we don't have any evidence that she ever knew that any of his other relationships with other women were emotional in nature.
Mm-hmm.
That's an important distinction.
So for her, having witnessed her father's behavior and from a distance, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy's behavior, decides what? That this is the way men behave, and it's an accommodation you have to make. I mean, Jack's best friend tells her before they get engaged, you should know this about my friend.
Yeah.
He'll never be faithful. He'll never change.
Yeah. Yeah. But I also think that letter she wrote, I quote it, she wrote a letter to Joan Kennedy when Joan Kennedy was deciding whether...
I have to have it right here.
Okay.
It's a fascinating letter.
Yeah.
I don't know. You tell me how you feel about it. It feels really sad to me, this letter.
Maybe realistic.
Okay. It's not what I would say, but okay. She tells Joan to be wary, essentially, that she's going to have to make accommodations to marry into this family. This is the 20th century, she writes, not the 19th, where little women stayed home on pedestal. Your life matters as much as his. You love him, but you can't destroy yourself. You want a life of sharing, not to wait quietly in the other room while he and his aides discuss his problems. Then he can have his girls on the side. You're no prude or fool. Men under pressure have to let off steam sometimes. So she's saying, basically, isn't she advising her to make your own life? Because if you're hoping that you're going to have a partnership, you're not.
Well, I think in that particular case, she's saying you have to look after yourself emotionally. If you look at the way Jackie led her life, she did many things independent of Jack. And she did not stay at the White House 7 days a week. But it was an accommodation. She also got to do what she wanted to do. I think there's also, probably she was not perhaps as fully cognizant of the degree of his womanizing as most accounts would have. And by the way, let me just say this too. This book that I wrote, I really, really, really tried to base it on primary sources, on letters and interviews where people are quoted directly. I'm going to be honest with you, people don't like to hear this, but because, presidential legends are so, they get stuck in people's heads. But William Howard Taft never got stuck in a bathtub. We have no evidence of it, but there's 3 or 4 stories which are conflated that would make one believe that. And there's still no evidence that Marilyn Monroe and Jack Kennedy had an affair. Now, it's so widely believed that people will probably say I'm a fool for saying that. But and maybe, of course, if there were letters or documents, they were all destroyed. Of course, that's a possibility. But the fact of the matter is, there is no primary source documentation that occurred.
And that's your job as a historian, right? To make sure that you can document what you assert. You're not in the business of telling people what happened if you can't provide
exactly right.
any evidence.
The only affair, and it was a premarital affair that is well documented, is in a book that was later published, The Love Letters by Gunilla. I forgot her last name, but she was a Swedish woman who Jack Kennedy met several weeks before he got married to Jackie, and did not, by the way, before the wedding, he did not have an affair with this woman. But
he waited till after they were married, apparently.
But the point being that there was some emotional connection there. And I think if Jackie had known about that, if Jackie had thought and known that he had a close emotional connection to a woman with whom he didn't have sex, that would be more upsetting to her than finding out about a woman he was sexually intimate with, but who had no emotional intimacy with, if that makes sense. She was, I think, more threatened by the lack of emotional monogamy. And the only documented evidence of that is this woman, Gunilla. And even that, it's not extensive, and she's, living in Europe. So I'm not whitewashing any of this stuff, but I'm also saying this, that like Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, like Bill and Hillary Clinton, like Bill and Nellie Taft, there was an intellectual component here that's always so easily dismissed, and it's never looked into. But for somebody
that's one of the things that your book does do. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about just the archival process, because as we were chatting before the program began, you were talking about doing research at the Kennedy Library. And one of the great things as a researcher is to stumble on material that you hoped was there, but you didn't know might not be there. And that also was never in the place you think it's going to be. Did that happen to you in a number of ways? First with Yusa, her stepbrother, who had remarkable letters from her to him, which are very revealing about what she's thinking about her own life. Can you tell us how you found those?
Yeah, well, it's funny. When I did, this book could not have been written had I not written As We Remember Her, which was published in 1997. And the first draft was a 1,000-page manuscript, and it made the young, eager editor so terrified she quit the publishing industry. But I luckily
the justification, I'd say 1,000 pages is a bit much.
But I saved everything, and but I had interviewed Yusha Auchincloss, and I spent a weekend in Newport with him, and he pulled out all these letters that Jackie had written him. I'm like, oh my God, what did she say? Oh my God, that's so, like, she was so revealing of herself and what she wanted out of the world and the way she saw things. And she really was like, she loved him. They were she was never in love with Yusha, but I think Yusha was in love with her. But they were siblings, and they became best friends. He's a key figure in her life, in her early life. And even her father, Blackjack Bouvier, began to think of Yusha as almost a son or a stepson, because Jackie tried to bring them together. She wanted to integrate her step family and her blood family. And she really loved her father, and she really wanted to, integrate him into her life. But Janet always tried to prevent it. But anyway, I said, Yusha, these letters are incredible. There's so many of them. I can't go through all of them. And I said, listen, you could sell these and make a lot of money, but just promise me that if you don't donate all the originals to the Kennedy Library, that you will at least make copies and donate the copies. Well, he donated them because I asked him to. And I went to the library in November, 3 months before the pandemic hits the world. Everything shuts down, including the Kennedy Library. I go there in November. I get there. I asked to see the Yusha Auchincloss papers. They said they're closed. It hasn't been processed yet. Next morning, I go in. They said, oh, they're open. So I was the first one to go through them and use them all. Then in her oral history with Arthur Schlesinger, she very casually mentions, oh, I translated a dozen books in French on Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam and the Ammonites and the Mennonites. And I did this for Jack, and he's got it. And I thought, he's got to ask me to marry him after doing this. And I thought, wow, I wonder if that exists. And I looked for it online in the Kennedy Library's online, finding guide. No, nothing like that about it. Nothing that shows that it still exists. I figured she must have thrown it out after all those years. But let me just maybe at least look at his speech on Vietnam, the first big one in June of 1953. And then I look at the correspondence and the other items, the research items that were used to prepare that speech. And lo and behold, in Jackie's handwriting and also partially typed, 88-page Vietnam report. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And I'm telling you, that along with the Vogue essays, it just, my head just blew up, because you got to keep reminding yourself, this is not Jackie Onassis, the 60-year-old book editor. This is Jackie Bouvier, the 21-year-old, the 22-year-old who's putting this stuff together. Jesus, I mean, this woman's mind, the depth and the breadth.
This was an opportunity for her to use that mind, right? She had been foreclosed from the opportunity at Vogue. The job was not that challenging at the Times Herald, at the Washington Times Herald. So she's doing this research for him. And interestingly enough, as she's doing this, she's engaged to somebody else. And
not during the Vietnam report, but during
before that.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking is her ambitions, her intellectual ambitions, to be part of something bigger.
Yes.
Than the life of a wealthy socialite, to be on the stage. Is that she got a taste of that in meeting Jack Kennedy? And did that lead to her saying, no, I don't want to be married to this fellow who I guess at one point she described as having as his greatest aspiration, making a perfect martini?
Yes, exactly. Yes. I think that's a big part of it. And she's very, here is a guy who is very important and wicked intelligent, who finds her to be intelligent and funny. And whereas John Husted had referred to her column as her insipid little column, Jack Kennedy, in one of his few messages to her, says, columns are excellent. You are missed. This is when she goes to cover Queen Elizabeth's coronation. So Jack Kennedy encouraged her intellect. Jack Kennedy he didn't, as she says, he didn't give me flowers and candy. He bought her books that he read, which she then read, which they then discussed and dissected. They both had sort of a fan fixation on now I just forgot his name, the British Byron, Lord Byron. I mean, and Jackie saw life through layers, and most people even today see it on one surface. And to have crossed the path of somebody who looked at life as having as many layers as she perceived it, and then was bright and funny, and then was ambitious, and then wanted to be a world leader, but who also believed in democracy. This is another big thing. We've gotten so cynical that, here today was the funeral of Rosalind Carter, a woman who, with her husband as partners, led in a 96-year life that was devoted to the well-being of others. Well, the Kennedys had a post-war view of the world, of democracy in the world, of democracy, of fairness, of education, of health. You look at those speeches she gave in South America, very simple on the surface, about education and nutrition and taking care of your children. But this is stuff that goes back to when they first met. This is his idea of the world. And
we have, I know, people out in the audience who're going to have a lot of questions for you. And it occurs to me that you're now talking about her appearances in South America. Your book ends when they get married.
Yeah.
So the obvious final question from me to you, before the audience gets to take a crack at this, is whether we can anticipate a sequel, a post-wedding story of Jackie's life.
I'm not sure. I think sometimes I've been thinking about covering her life as a Senate wife and campaign wife, and that was in fact just like she wrote The Inquiring Camera Girl. She also wrote something called Campaign Wife during the 1960 election. She went back to her writing, and she blended personal stories of herself and what kind of chronicling what was going on with her and her daughter and her husband, with issues that were part of the political issues of the campaign. And I had interviewed Joan Braden, who was a friend of hers, who helped her to edit and organize those columns. And so I have an extensive amount of material from the 1960 campaign, which is interesting. So that's a possibility. Because I've written the 2-volume history First Ladies, Jackie herself helped me with those books.
Yeah.
And so, and my God, there's no time to talk about this, but, there is this really fascinating, there is still a lot that is untold about her, and her being haunted by the issue of Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And that continues until well past 1980, until Teddy Kennedy becomes chairman of the Senate Committee on Refugees. Mm-hmm. And it ties back to Jackie saying, if you really want to be true to the legacy, the Kennedy family legacy, you'll be more interested in helping them than you will be in getting the presidency. So it's really quite fascinating. There's some stuff that ties into the assassination that
Well, you may get questions about all of this momentarily.
No,
Ellen is rejoining us to help us integrate the audience into our conversation.
Yes.
First, I just have to say this has been super fascinating, and we have terrific questions coming at you. And I'm particularly intrigued by some of them that call for some speculation, which as a library director, I don't typically engage in, but you have a little bit more freedom, I believe, to speculate about some of these things. But the first two questions, two different people, but they are very much related. How did you get inspired to do this biography of this foundational part of her life? What was the catalyst for you? And also related to that is, what was the most difficult aspect of writing this book?
I always was drawn to this person because of her passion for history and with the way she lived with history in the modern world. In her imagination, yes, most obviously the interiors of the White House, that kind of thing, but she just understood the value of history. And when I wrote As We Remember Her, that's a cradle to grave oral history biography. And I had so much good material that had to be cut, and particularly the newspaper columns. And I didn't even use like half of the newspaper columns, which still makes me feel like bad that there's so much I had to cut from this. But it seems that when you have a complex person like Jacqueline Bouvier, you need to slow the narrative down. If you're going to understand a complex person, you need to slow the narrative down so you could take time to examine each of these, many folders that she would have open on her desk, so to speak, at any one moment. So I think that was important. And I also wanted her just as Jackie Bouvier. Originally, I was going to end the book in April of 1954 when he gives his big Senate speech on Vietnam. And I decided, no, this is going to be just pure Bouvier. This book is just about Jackie Bouvier. Of course, I wanted to call it that. My editors were like, well, not enough people are going to know who that is anymore, so you need the name Kennedy in there. But yeah, I just wanted this to be purely about her. And the second question again?
Well, what was the hardest part of writing this book?
The hardest part of writing this book was trying to trace her activities between September 1951 and December 1951. I literally would, you're chronicling things. And so I have like a lot of her early life, I'd say like from her birth, like 1929 to like 1949. The narrative begins in 1949 when she's turning 20 years old. And, she's in East Hampton with her famous aunt, Edith Beale, Big Edie, singing the Marseillaise before she leaves for France, and happy birthday to her at what proves to be really one of the last gatherings of the Bouvier family. But then there's some material that goes back. So I look at those first 20 years in a sort of, it's not all a complete chronological line. But once I've got her back, once she's in Europe, it's a straight chronology from September I think I'm remembering this right. We moved the material around so much, but by the time we get to the fall of 1951, the book is a running narrative. It's a running chronology. And for some reason, there's not a lot of documentation about her and her life at that period. So that was the hardest thing. And I had to do some speculating.
Super. Here's the next question. I loved the story about Jackie wandering around post-war Vienna with her camera and getting into trouble with the authorities. Did she share any of that with anyone during the state visit of 1961?
That I don't know, but she wrote about it in a letter, first of all, to her stepbrother Yusha, and then she wrote about it to Bob McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense. And by the way, she wrote this to McNamara after the president's death, that the 3 hours that she spent under being held by the Soviets for questioning was, as she called it, the most terrifying time of my life, which is, considering what she'd been through by the time she wrote that letter, is quite a remarkable thing for her to write.
Indeed. We have a couple of questions. People are fascinated by this fellow John Husted Jr. And so first one is, John was so discreet about his relationship with Jackie Bouvier. Did they ever reconnect? Is the first question.
They stayed friends. He met Jack Kennedy. And when Molly Thayer, who was a force to be reckoned with, Mary Van Rensselaer Thayer, Mrs. Walter Thayer the Fourth, I think she was. And she was a friend of Janet's. And as Jackie used to call these women who would gather with her mother, the Dragon Ladies, who would play bridge together and all, shout commands at each other. Here was Jackie, her husband's just been elected president. She's about to have cesarean birth. And Molly Thayer is like, well, I think, what we've got to do is, you've got to write your autobiography. That's the only way to get all the facts out there. There's so many and Janet, her mother, was like, yes, that's what. So she, is moving into the white. It's crazy period. But anyway, she would write, Molly would send questions to her, and Jackie would write them back. And she said, John, you said, I want him kept out of this story, which was crazy because it had been announced at the time and they were engaged, that it was in the paper, and it had been announced that they broke up. But when she was working on that biography, basically her autobiography, with Molly Thayer, she said, John Husted has been nothing but a gentleman. I don't want his name brought into it at all. So they did stay friendly with each other.
Excellent. The follow-up question from a different viewer is, what do you think might have happened if she had married John Husted instead?
She would have divorced John Husted.
Or she would have become the editor of the Washington Post.
Yeah. He was, he was not as open-minded as Jack Kennedy about her working. I didn't mention that, but that's a little episode in this. She actually had plans. We have it in her own words. She had plans to continue working after marriage, when she came back after the wedding, after the honeymoon, and she had hoped to continue working at the paper. And Joe Kennedy kind of put the kibosh on that one.
So a related and a follow-up question to that. One is the simple, how long did Jackie work as the newspaper's camera girl?
She was there from January of 50. Well, kind of started out trial basis Well, and I should say she was a clerk, which she never wanted anybody to know about. Like November, December 51, and then officially really starts January of 52, and then ends in June of 53. So like a full solid year and a half. 6 days a week, the column appears, 6 days a week.
And the related question is, if John F. Kennedy had lived, do you think Jackie would have eventually worked in publishing anyway, or would he have likely insisted that she not work for the remainder of their lives post-presidency?
Well, when we say if, right,
Yes, many what ifs there.
yeah, she would be 94. He'd be over 100. It's hard to say. I think they might have both gone into publishing. I think maybe he might have written and she might have edited his books. I think she might have worked a little bit helping him. I mean, there's evidence that she did that with his speeches in the Senate. I've gotten some indications and some proof. And she later did that with Bobby Kennedy. There is, in fact, at the Kennedy Library, at least one of Bobby Kennedy's speeches, which Jackie edited. So I think that was a natural inclination for her. And I don't think Jack Kennedy would have insisted on anything with her. I think they would have negotiated it, but I don't think he could have really insisted on anything with her. There's a famous story about, where he had to do something and he wanted her to attend like a congressional wives luncheon, and he pleaded with her, and finally she was like, well, okay, if you come to the symphony with me. And so they would negotiate, so she didn't just roll over ever for him.
Got it. So there's a question and some answer going on in the chat right now about which family was more financially prosperous, the Kennedys or the Bouviers?
The Lees, her maternal grandfather, was on the level of Joe Kennedy with his wealth. The famous story being that Jim Lee had told Joe Kennedy about this property called the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, and Joe Kennedy kind of double-crossed him and bought it. So that is the legend in the families, is that was the root of the acrimony between them. The Bouviers were Democrats, by the way. It's interesting. They were originally Democrats, and it was FDR's third term that they started to become Republicans. But they've always been described as being Republican families, and they were not. They were Democrats. Only later on became Republicans. And the Bouviers, both her grandfather. Well, what's interesting is the Bouvier money was really her grandmother's money. It was her dad's mother, her grandma Maud Sargent. Her money, big real estate people in New York. And then they bought, so it was all her money that bought all the places in, I think 3 pieces of real estate in East Hampton. And the granddad kind of went through all the money. So when he died, they were all shocked to find out how little they were inheriting.
Fascinating. The next question is, out of all this research, what's a remarkable story that you think would really share a lot about the personal qualities and character of Jackie Bouvier Kennedy for the public and for other historians?
Well, gosh, there's one letter she wrote, Yusha, that really stayed with me, and it was about him wanting to join the Marines, and her not trying to dissuade him, but saying, you're also going to be exposed to a lot of people who are bitter and who are bigoted and prejudiced. And it's going to be unfortunate, but you're going to mix with people from less privileged circumstances than your own, and people who have more hate and bitterness. And it's really basically your responsibility to make your world happy, that basically you have to find your own happiness. And so I think I think that letter, I wish I could find it quickly and I would read it to you, but it's in the book.
But people should read this book. Look, I want to step to a question that was raised, and you touched upon this. It's about a different first lady. That is, Rosalind Carter passed recently. Do you have any further thoughts you can share about her and her life?
She had humility and compassion, and it was authentic. And I loved her dearly. I knew her. I think she's the last of a generation. Nancy Reagan, Betty Ford, Jackie, Barbara Bush, all women born in the 1920s, all now gone. Lady Bird and Pat Nixon were actually born in the teens, 1912. So they were actually a little bit older. But, it's just fascinating to see the passage of time. There's a photograph of the dedication of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library, and Lady Bird, Pat Nixon, Rosalind Carter, Betty Ford, Nancy Reagan, and Barbara Bush are all in that picture, and they're all gone now. So now we see at Mrs. Carter's funeral, we saw Mrs. Biden, Mrs. Trump, Mrs. Obama, Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, and Mrs. Clinton, all there gathered. So, it's part of it's our story is always part of the larger story.
Indeed. One day there'll be a photo, look back, and we'll say, look at all these first husbands.
I'm waiting for that day. Well,
yes. A personal question for me. That is on behalf of the library. In 2029, we will put on an exhibit, a retrospective about Mrs. Kennedy, celebrating the 100th anniversary of her book. And while many people are certainly going to be excited that we're going to bring out many of the dresses that we can't expose to light, but only so often, I also want to show her intellectual side. She is, I think, a tremendously powerful woman who does so much at such a young age. As First Lady, are there things that you think, oh, you absolutely have to put this in the exhibit? And the longer term question is, I hope you'll partner with us in developing this exhibit.
Oh my gosh, that's such an honor. That is really an honor, because I want to tell you something. She is worthy of emulation. She is really worthy of study. She really lived conscientiously, and all the glitz and the glamour stuff, that might bring in the crowds, but maybe half of the crowds will also linger and read the letters and the documents. So, I think examples of her watercolors, her cartoons, her illustrated books, her creativity in so many different forms. There's something called executive function, which allows the brain to work, to keep several things going at one time. that has been linked to people who, as adults, learn multiple languages, which was true of her. And I think when you look at even the way she conducted the White House restoration, it was multi-pronged. And I think you see this with her, is that she was always she was very good at organizing. She had the art of organizing down, structure. I think that's why she was such a good editor. She understood the structure that's necessary in telling a compelling story. But I don't know. It's a challenge, isn't it? To how do you show the mind of a person?
Yes.
Which is something, but I think you could, I think by bringing out some examples of her different kinds of work that she did, her artistic and creative work, her humor, the cards, you could do a whole section. I mean, I've made copies of stuff that I could send you, which is stuff from what's in your collections, but so many cartoons of herself. She at times turned herself into a caricature, always to get a laugh. Always, she had such an incredible sense of humor. I mean, wicked sense of humor. I remember once Lisa Drew, who was a friend of hers and my editor of First Ladies and a colleague of hers, and she would send little clippings from the paper about how, there was something that Dolly Parton was quoted in a gossip column saying, "I'm thinking of writing a memoir. It'll be a little bit country. It'll be a little bit slutty. It'll be a little bit trashy." And Jackie wrote in the side of the column, "Another cultural watershed." She's just like the master of, the understatement. Or a letter when there's a flood in the house and she describes like all the furniture is floating around me and I'm just standing here taking it in and everyone is crying and screaming hysterically. Both in the narrative and the cartooning form, she loved to make fun of herself.
Wonderful. We have some questions about sort of updates on some of the characters. And by the way, the comment is, your research is amazing. And is Yusha still living in Newport? And isn't Charles Bartlett's widow still living? And what about the couple who introduced Jackie and JFK?
The Bartletts, yes. Charlie
Okay.
Bartlett. Yeah, Charlie Bartlett died, I believe. Well, both Yusha, I think Yusha may have died in 2014. I don't know. I think the 20 teens, and Charlie Bartlett as well. But Martha Bartlett is going strong at, I think, 95 or 96. In fact, when Camera Girl came out in May, there was a segment that aired on CBS Sunday Morning about the book and about the Jack Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier's engagement. And Martha is interviewed in that. And she's strong, she's lucid, she's very funny, and very honest. And she is still around, yes. And so is Claude Durenti, who Jackie lived with in Paris. And so is Mamie Moore, who was the little girl that Jackie stalked to get an interview and get on the front page of the paper.
That was such a fascinating story. Two more questions before we wrap up. One is, could you talk about Jackie's relationship with her grown children in terms of what she passed to them?
I don't really know, and I don't feel qualified to really answer them, other than the fact that she so prized education. I do remember that when John was at Brown, he took a course on the history of Vietnam, and that she became very involved in that and interested in that. I think her daughter, having served as an ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Japan, now U.S. ambassador to Australia, it seems like a natural kind of job or role that Jackie herself might have played. That said, I often think that parents are given too much credit and too much blame, that each individual develops themselves and each individual, maybe uses what they have from their parents as a basis, a jumping off point. I do know that she told her son about me and my books and my writing, and I suspect that's how I was initially drafted, so to speak, for George Magazine.
Makes sense. Last question. Boy, this is a tough one. You ready? Who was your favorite First Lady?
Well, I think I would have to say probably Jackie Kennedy, but also,
right answer.
When you write a biography, I don't know if you feel this way about Eunice. I could not write a biography about somebody I really didn't like or whose values I didn't share. I don't think I could do that. And so the 4 full-length biographies that I have written have been Nellie Taft, Florence Harding, Jackie Kennedy, and Ida McKinley. Oddly, 3 of those left the White House as widows. 2 of them are buried in Arlington. 2 of them lost their husband to assassination. 3 of them are from Ohio. So I don't know what that means other than that. And 3 of them were Republicans and 1 a Democrat. But I would say that they would probably be my 4 favorite, because I had to have an interest in them in order to sacrifice so much of my life, to devote to researching them and to write about them.
And I'll bounce the same question over to you, Eileen. Do you have a favorite First Lady?
That's interesting. It's a question I've never really thought about, because it's only really in modern times that we've really
started to
credited them with having a serious role. I guess I would have to say it would be Eleanor Roosevelt.
A fine choice. The second best answer to that question.
I will say this. There is a misunderstanding. People were interested in First Ladies way back. It was just all we had were newspapers then. But there would be, oh my God, there were so many critical columns about Mary Lincoln. Amazing. And then, the strength and the character of Lucretia Garfield, when her husband was shot and he lingered for 2 months, and she had so much confidence. And there have been moments throughout our history before Eleanor Roosevelt when certain of these women rose up in the national consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Well, thank you both for being with us this evening. Thank you for sacrificing much of your life to get this book done and to us. Eileen, thank you. Terrific job moderating. And thanks to the audience for joining us this evening and all the sponsors who made this possible. A truly fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.